this episode of Artist Tales, I'm joined by painter Twinkle Troughton, an artist whose work unpicks the stories we inherit about the English landscape, the myths, the politics, and the quiet histories that sit beneath its surface. From the manicured gardens of stately homes to plants brought here through centuries of colonial trade, Twinkle's painting invite us to look again at what we think of as quintessentially English. Welcome, Twinkle.
Hi, thank you for having me.
It's really lovely having you. So I've introduced you and given a little bit of background, but could you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
So I'm an artist. I'm living in Margate. My studio's in Margate. I'm currently speaking to you from a studio in Hoxton now, where I'm currently finishing up a 3-month residency at Standpoint Gallery. I was awarded the residency at the end of my MA, which I just completed at City and Guild in September of last year. And it's been a really fantastic opportunity. I've been making work responding to the trees in Hoxton Square. And I used to live in Hoxton about 20 years ago. So it's a very familiar space to me. And I've come back to visit it anew and unearth the history of the trees there, and also talk about my own connections to the trees there. When I lived in Hoxton, I was in a punk band called the Fairies Band, and we wore fairy wings every day. We had ripped fishnets and white stilettos, and we were raucous and wild. And the whole time I was also working as an artist. I would paint in my bedroom, which is like on Hackney Road, just a stone's throw from Hoxton Square, where I am now. And I just had an absolutely wild ride living in London for about 18 years. Then I moved to Margate, where I continued to pursue my art career. I also started writing while I've been living in Margate, which has resulted in me somehow becoming the editor of a local, hyperlocal magazine there called the Margate Mercury. But I'm currently just about to hand the reins over to a new editor because I just want to be able to focus my creative energies into my artwork entirely now. But that's been a wonderful few years doing that as well. So I guess I do a bit of all sorts really, but I think it's always creative endeavours which drive me. I've tried to turn my hand to many different things. We even set up a record label when we were in a band called Pushing Pussy Records, and this was like in the sort of early 2000s, and the point of the record label was to champion female band members or bands with a female either singer or musician or a manager who was female, but the band had to have some kind of female involvement. And we put out EPs, and the band I was in, we put out a few vinyl records, and we did some gigs in New York and Philadelphia, and I've had a very good laugh along the way and worked hard as well. But it's been an interesting few decades.
It sounds very eclectic, your career. As you were speaking, the word that came to mind, as I said, was eclectic. It sounds like you've been involved with quite a lot.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I mean. I think I get excited by various different creative outlets. I think the thing that's been a constant, and this is ever since I was a child, is painting. So that's been the thing that I have come back to again and again, and which has, I guess, really has my heart. I mean, music and the band, they became my whole focus for a while, and they were as important to me as the painting. But the painting is the thing that's always been there throughout everything that I've ever sort of turned my hand to or any roads that I've gone down. That's always been at the end of it.
I'll get to the painting in a minute, but I'm conscious you have collaborated with Tinsel Edwards, who I've interviewed for this series as well. So could you tell us a bit more about some of your collaborations, including working with Tinsel?
Yeah, well, so Tinsel, who I've done all of those projects, who I was in the band with, along with my sister Tinky and our best friend Sparkle. I did the record label with Tinsel, and myself and Tinsel also collaborated on quite a few kind of, I guess we called them like public intervention artworks, where we would I guess become different characters like traffic wardens or What else did we do? We've done so many, it's so hard for me to remember off the top of my head, but everything would have a purpose or a political motivation or a political message and we'd find a way of going out there to interact with people. But there was always like an artwork at the source of it as well. So yeah, myself and Tinsel have been long time collaborators, even like going back to when we first met when we were 9 years old. We were in a gang called the Yo Gang, but even though it's got the word gang, we were just all about peace and love and hippies. And then we formed a band called the Jesus Mirrors, and we've just constantly done stuff together like that our whole life since we met at 9 years old. She's brilliant.
Yeah, no, it sounds like quite a good and creative collaboration with Tinsel.
We have absolutely inspired and driven each other creatively throughout our whole lives, definitely. When we lived together in London, we lived together for a long time, and we would put on group shows together, we would curate exhibitions together, we would always end up talking into the early hours of the morning about our work. Then when we both moved out into our own separate places, we would still meet up to have like critical conversations about our work, and we would both bring new work along. And yeah, she's had a huge part to play in everything I've done throughout the years.
She sounds like quite a big influence for you.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we were at school together, and when my dad was our art teacher, so he's also had a very big role to play. But we also then went to different universities, but we ended up collaborating on our whole degree show. So we ended up like joining forces and putting on identical degree shows in each other's colleges. So, and that was quite funny because we both didn't get into each other's universities. So I didn't get into Goldsmiths and she didn't get into Kingston, but we ended up having degree shows in each other's colleges anyway. So I think that was kind of like we were having a bit of a laugh at the system by doing that. But also it was just a great opportunity to get our work seen to each other's audiences. And we've been creating a whole body of work about the group we were in called the Fairies.
That sounds brilliant. That sounds really quite a nice creative collaboration. I do want to get onto your painting because, as you've said, it's a constant, thing in your life, even though you're doing other things as well. So that you seem to cover quite a number of different topics. So I did talk about, in the introduction, the theme about the English landscape. So could you talk a little bit about that and the myth of the English landscape?
Yeah, sure. So I've been making work kind of delving into and inspired by the English landscape probably for about 4 or 5 years now, but going back further than that, trees and nature have been present in my work for a long time. However, when I started first making work about the English landscape, it was literally just I'd seen a picture of a topiary garden, thought how bonkers topiary looked, but also how magical and weird it looked, and just that was my main instigation for just starting to paint it. At the time, I'd gone back to the drawing board with how I was painting. So I'd been painting quite tightly and almost photographically and very representationally. And I knew I hadn't found my own language with paint at that point. So I'd kind of reached this crisis in the studio, and I just thought there's something in me. I need to find what it is, how I want to use paint. And so as I was painting these topiaries, I then also started literally flipping how I painted on its head. I just thought I've got to just do the opposite of what I've been doing to try and find what it is that I want to do. So I started just covering surfaces like whole sheets of paper with oil paint, and then using solvents to lift the paint off the surface, creating like translucence, and there's a kind of corrosion that goes on. And the two things just seemed to work really well together. But at that stage, I had no idea why. I didn't know why they complemented each other or what the story was yet. And then I started, and then I got to the stage where I knew I wanted to do an MA. I hadn't painted, I didn't do painting at university. I did a course called Fine Art Intermedia, and then started painting as soon as I graduated. It was like I knew I wanted to be a painter. Somehow I'd veered off the painting course. And so I'd kind of been self-teaching ever since I graduated. And I just really knew that I wanted to go back to an institution to learn from really knowledgeable tutors and actually really get to grips with my practice. So that's why I did the MA at City and Guilds. And it was there that I really sort of did a deep dive into the English landscape, where I really got to grips and understood what it was that about the English landscape that fascinated me, but also then how my painting technique helped to tell the story of the English landscape. And what it is that I discovered about the English landscape is that much of it is made up from species of flora and fauna from around the globe. So actually what we look at and think is like a quintessentially English landscape, or has, the green and pleasant land. It's like it fits into this myth of the green and pleasant land. It's actually not English. It's actually very culturally diverse. And then the other thing that started to come to light through my research was that these spaces were, especially in relation to like stately home gardens, or especially like from the 18th century and give or take a few decades, is that they were actually a lot of them were funded by profits from the slave trade, or were the result of this country's like imperial and colonial pursuits. So often species would be brought back into the country by colonialists who had gone off venturing around the globe. And so a lot of the reasons why these species exist within our landscape kind of have these really dark roots. There's a real darkness to how and why they came to be here. But what they've become are these really incredible spaces that foster biodiversity, and they have become sites for healing in light of climate change. And so they've kind of got this duality of darkness and light to them, which I find really fascinating. I've always been extremely passionate about trees and verdant spaces. It's always been somewhere that I've just longed and yearned to be in. I grew up in the countryside for a few years as a child, and I think that those formative years really have had an impact on my love of being out in these natural spaces. So it's not like an arbitrary love of being in these spaces, but I'd never really considered their origin before until I'd sort of done this deep dive during the MA. And so sort of also having a kind of intrigue in spiritual, rules of can't have light without darkness, and drawing light from darkness and removing darkness to reveal light. And these all come into play with these, in terms of these spaces, but then also with how I paint, with removing paint from a surface to create light. So I'm removing darkness to create luminosity. So there's a lot of kind of parallels that are going on with the spaces and the paint and these kind of spiritual ideas.
Just listening to you, that's quite an interesting thread in terms of what we take for granted as the quote-unquote English landscape. But as you say, it touches on colonial legacy, class, some of those big estates, that's class hierarchies, and also like healing and ecology. But in the light and darkness, I think both in terms of nature, but also the human experience, in terms of, the colonial legacies are quite a dark history in human history, and how that can then influence so many different things. And in a way, as listening to you, it's, what I'm hearing is kind of the environment, even the natural environment reflects kind of human history and human experience and human intervention even.
Yeah, I mean, the landscapes are filled with intervention, and that's it. So the class that you mentioned there as well, our class system is ingrained in our landscape, and that was another thing that I just had not realised. Literally, so much of its design, even when you think you're out in a wild space, actually, it's been more likely than not to have been designed that way, and a lot of it will always end up being connected back somehow to this country's class system, which just really shapes so much more than we realise. So the reason why pheasants are in our landscape is because they're connected to shooting and hunting. They're actually an Asian bird, and they were brought here as a game bird. And shooting and hunting, this is like not even as a means of survival. This is sport. You know, they were brought here as sport, as entertainment, always for the rich and wealthy. Quite often copses of trees that we might see just out on the landscape will have been planted specifically for hunting. There's muntjacs and squirrels the grey squirrel, for example, was brought over here by a duke, Herbrand Russell, at the Woburn estate. He was a duke who it's thought he was responsible in introducing the grey squirrel to the UK. And he basically imported 10 grey squirrels from New Jersey to live on his estate. Obviously, he didn't somehow register that a squirrel can just hop off and do whatever it wants to do. But he would also start gifting them, because to a lot of these rich, wealthy landowners, to have unusual animals on your land was a way of showing off. It was a way of having status. It was a way of showing people how powerful you were. So he would gift these squirrels to other people, such as he gifted them to Regent's Park and Kew Gardens. And it was all just in the name of showing off, really. And then they clearly reproduced, and now you literally can't go anywhere in the UK and not see a grey squirrel. And the same is with the muntjac. The same duke brought muntjacs to live on his estate, and they escaped and started breeding and have become naturalised over the centuries. So it's these little flashes of all these things have a story. They're connected to someone or something in our history, more often than not, that's connected to our class system, or to, like like I said, the country's like kind of colonial pursuits through the centuries. And I think it's just, for me, that thing, like, I love seeing squirrels. I'd never have even thought something so unassuming had such a sort of significant story attached to it, that these animals were kind of playthings as a tool for showing off. I just would never have put that to it. And so the more I unearthed about what I've seen in the landscape and realised that it's got a story as to how and why it exists there, the more, I guess, intrigued, and the more work I realised I've got to do to kind of keep, like, there's so many stories to unearth here and tell.
Yeah, and I think you're not alone, in terms of learning that history, because I think most of us probably wouldn't be aware necessarily of that history that we're seeing. But also, I think it's, from what it sounds like, you're unearthing history. It's almost like you're peeling back, perhaps the assumptions that we now have over the, years, decades, generations of, people doing things and bringing animals or plants back, or, whatever, and how that has influenced the country and the natural landscape. So I'm just curious too, we did talk about Tinsel Edwards in terms of a collaborator. Are there any other collaborators or influences that you have had over your career so far?
I mean, so I wouldn't sort of say collaborators as such, but there's a wonderful gardens near where I live in Faversham. I don't live in Faversham, sorry. The gardens are near Faversham in Kent, called Doddington Place Gardens. And they found me on Instagram. I think I'd been posting my topiary paintings, and they just got in touch and said, why don't you come and paint here? And it's a 19th century stately home in amongst this. It's actually like 19th, turn of the century, 20th, with a garden that was kind of recreated in the image of an 18th century garden. But it was a wonderful experience that they gave me, an opportunity to just go along whenever I wanted and paint out in the space. And just, it's the first time I'd ever actually done that, like gone and painted in a landscape. And so I normally work from imagery within a studio. So they've been really supportive and given me lots of opportunities. And also Lucy Adams, who's their head gardener, she has also been really supportive and helpful to me with my dissertation. She took me on a whole tour of the gardens, and we did a tree tour, and she talked about all the species that she knew about. We talked about old historical landscape designers like Capability Brown, who himself is very responsible for a lot of the landscapes that we see now, and he almost made the green and pleasant land. He was the person who kind of realised that and manifested that aesthetic, the kind of looking out of your garden and seeing a sweeping landscape. And so she really helped me delve into the world of botany a lot more, which then inspired me to go off and do other tours around arboretums and just sort of really get to know what the people who work within that world know, and to find out what it is that they can teach me about what's going on in these spaces. One of the things that I think is so fascinating is that, so Lucy said that there's a lot of people, they are now having to look outwards in light of climate change. A lot of species that have just existed for centuries in this country are now struggling to survive. They're struggling to survive the wet winters and the summers, which are going to become hotter and drier. And so they're now having to look outwards around the globe again at other species that they can bring in that match the climate that we're experiencing now. So we're still having to look outwards to bring it in, but this time it's from a place of collaboration rather than taking what's not ours or just taking to enrich ourselves. This time it's botanists and experts from around the globe working together to try and create flourishing sites of biodiversity to keep the planet healthy. So there's lots of really interesting work that these people are doing that I've been learning about through my research as well.
That sounds really interesting that you've been invited to a property to paint, and it sounds like you're really learning quite a lot of, in terms of botany and that sort of thing. I guess there are a couple of questions I have. Firstly, are there favorite places, are there favorite kind of landscapes that you find yourself being drawn back to time and again?
Not specific places as such, but I do seek out going to green spaces. Where I live in Margate, we've got a really low tree count. I mean, it's one of the lowest in the country. And to me, that's really, really noticeable. The lack of green there is something that, I mean, in the whole 11 years I've lived there, I've done one painting of the sea. Everything else has been mostly of trees, even though there's not many trees there. So I do specifically go out to look, to be amongst trees. And in the Midlands where I'm from, when I go home to visit my parents in Warwickshire, I will just try and get out walking in the landscapes there, because they're where I grew up, the rolling kind of green hills and lush trees, and there's just an abundance of green there. And I just seek it out. I just feel like I need to be amongst it. So it's not that I necessarily have a space that I return to, but I do go and seek out those spaces. There's some really interesting stately homes in Warwickshire where I'm from, where I used to visit as a child, that I've gone back to now to go and research what's growing there as well. There's Charlcote House or Charlcote Hall and Compton Verney, and both of those are actually Capability Brown gardens as well. So there's a lot of history embedded there. But as I said, that's the thing about these spaces, the duality of the light and dark. It's, although I understand that the origins of these places are dark, I'm not saying that they shouldn't exist. And I definitely I'm not trying to lead any kind of campaign of hate against them, because I think they're beautiful at the same time, visually beautiful, but they have a darkness to them. And that's what I try and draw out in my work, is the beauty and the darkness. but there is a place for them, and there is a place for them in that they tell our story. And if we can acknowledge our story, acknowledge our past, then I feel like that's where healing can take place, or where accountability can take place, or where we can, or where people can start to come together again, when we acknowledge things that UK may have, or has done, that have been atrocious in the past. But that legacy of those green spaces, really, they belong to everyone, because culturally there's going to be a connection to you wherever you're from, somewhere within that space. I think we have a problem of accessibility to those spaces, because a lot of them, there's a very high price to get in. There's a high ticket charge to get into them. But once you start to understand what grows there, you then see where those spaces exist outside of those gardens, what might have once been a stately home garden, but is now part of our kind of a landscape which you could go walking in. And so I'm just hoping that these stories would help. Well, my kind of dream would be that they would help people feel connected to the landscape somehow, that it contains all of our stories. Somewhere within that, there's a connection to who you are and where you're from.
And I think that's so important, because it's being honest about the place. So it's seeing the beauty, but also being honest that it does have a history. And quite often it can be quite a difficult, dark history as well.
Incredibly painful. I mean, this is the thing. So I don't attempt to speak on behalf of other people. Obviously, my background is not from a background connected to the slave trade, either side. But I'm definitely not connected to a family that is here because I was brought here as a result of slavery. I'm not in any way trying to speak on behalf of people who those painful stories are connected to. But what I'm fascinated in, and this is someone who I'm myself, my own lineage is quite diverse as well. It's just about, no matter who you are, that the English landscape, it's just actually a space that reflects all of us, and I think unearthing these stories can just help find that connection.
And that's certainly coming across. And I was going to say, what I'm hearing is connections.
Yeah.
And you said it's about connections. So yeah, that does sound like quite a strong theme in your work. The other question I thought of as well is, you mentioned that you were commissioned by property in Faversham. Have you had a lot of people come to you, or have you had organisations come to you for commission?
It wasn't a commission with Doddington Place. They just said that I could just go there whenever I wanted to paint and use it as a space for research. So it wasn't a commission.
Oh, sorry, I misunderstood.
And I haven't really having only just graduated, I've literally gone from the MA to this residency. So my whole focus at the moment has been working on the trees that are growing in Hoxton Square.
And that sounds like quite an interesting project in itself. And as you said, it's kind of, that area. So does it feel like a bit of a homecoming?
Yeah, I've absolutely loved being back here. It's been so nostalgic, and I also keep forgetting that I don't live here. So I've had times where I've been walking around and I feel like, I just live around the corner, and then I remember that I don't. I live in Margate. But it's been just such a wonderful experience coming back and working here and being part of everyday life here again. And the space that I've been given is brilliant, and it's just been so. Because the square, for me, when I was in my 20s, it was a place of partying. It was a place of hedonism for me. It was a place where me and my friends would meet with cans of beer and sit on a Saturday afternoon after band practice, and where friends would come and meet us. Or we even did a photo shoot for one of our band's EP covers in the middle of Hoxton Square. But I would never have even considered, as much as I loved trees there, and I would never have considered that there was any history to the reason why those trees were there. So again, it's been really interesting to unearth the story of those trees. The main tree that grows there is the London plane. It's a hybrid tree. It's Asian and American, and it was discovered in the nursery of a tree hunter called John Tradescant the Younger. I think that's how you pronounce his name. Apologies if I've said that wrong. He was a famous tree hunter, and his dad was a famous tree hunter as well. And between them, they travelled, this is in the 1600s, they travelled to 3 of the continents, which was a lot of travelling back then. And while it's known that tree hunters themselves didn't necessarily have imperial ambitions, they would often follow in the footsteps of the empire or of colonialists that were going out to find new lands, or because the path was already trodden, and then they would go out there to research the botany that was in these places. I think what's become known later on is that often botany and knowledge were taken and no credit or remuneration was ever given back. So this botany enriched the empire, the knowledge, the scientific knowledge that was gained from the botany. It all enriched and empowered the empire, all European empires. But so anyway, going back to this tree, it was discovered as an accidental hybrid discovered in this nursery in Vauxhall. But it emerged that this tree was really, really resilient to pollution. So it then it's now the most populous tree in London because of that. And it's also been exported globally around the world. So you'll find it growing in cities around the globe. New York is absolutely full of the London plane. I think they grow in Rome. They grow in all sorts of places because of its resilience and its strength. So again, it's one of these trees that's kind of got this. The reason for it being there is from the darker sides to our history, but its purpose has become really important and filled with light and filled with like this energy that we need. And so it's that duality that the tree has. And it's also, I read an article in the New Yorker by a writer called Alison Kinney, and it was all about the London plane. And in it, she describes it as the tough immigrant tree in New York, doing the work that immigrants have always done. That this tree is the one cleaning the air. It's the one consistently there cleaning up, making the place sustainable and a nice place for people to live in. And it's that likening of the tree to connecting it to stories of migration. It's just what constantly draws me back and drives me on, and what I just find so continually fascinating about our natural world is just how connected to stories of migration it is. And again, that it presents that opportunity for connection.
And there's so many layers there. And that's, I guess, part of human history, but also part of the natural history as well.
Yeah, so much. And I haven't even touched the edges. There's so much more to even talk about. The fact that they were planted in Hoxton Square in the early 1700s by the local residents at the time who wanted to turn the square into a pleasant place to be because the square had undergone a period of decline. And actually Hoxton Square has always gone through periods of decline and then sort of come back to life again, and it's attracted religious dissenters, and it's always kind of had this kind of rebellious edge to it. And so yeah, there's so much you can draw from learning about a tree into you can draw the stories from the area it's in and why it's there.
I think you're so right on that. And I think, with trees, there's such history. Even, the rings around the tree, like if you cut, a section of it, you can kind of tell when there is, a lot of rain or when there's drought, how thick or thin each ring of a tree is. So it does have that kind of collective history.
Yeah. They really tell their own stories. That's the title of the show. So as part of the residency here, I get an exhibition at the end of the show. And the title of the show is Conclusions of the City Forest. Part of the city forest is because London is actually classed as a forest due to its high tree count, so for me, coming from somewhere with a really low tree count, I actually feel like I come somewhere leafy when I come to London. But occlusions are actually the wounds on a tree. So they tell the tree's story, and they never heal, they never go away. They become part of the tree's physical makeup, as it were. Like, you can see the gnarly wounds in the tree's trunk. And so again, the tree carries its own story. And I thought it was quite pertinent to have a word connected to wounds there, because our landscapes are so full of wounds, stories to do with pain and suffering. But then with the tree, its resilience, they carry on growing, they keep reaching for the sky, they keep doing what this wonderful thing that they've been put here to do, which is make our air clean and make our world beautiful. And so it's about overcoming those wounds, but not forgetting them.
Indeed, and it's that duality, isn't it? So my final question is, looking forward, what's next? What do you see on the horizon?
I mean, I feel like I've kind of only just started this work in a way. I feel like there's so much to learn. Just doing this residency has pushed my work on so much from between the MA show and now. Already I can see the growth in the work, the knowledge that is deepening. There's a new fascination creeping in with the actual bark of trees, and also just pushing my this technique of removal of paint, of using solvents. So the thing that I have kind of acknowledged about my paintings is they are quite toxic in and of themselves, because I use solvents and oil paints to create a painting. So the paintings themselves are toxic, and I mean, I'm not saying I make beautiful paintings, but of beautiful things. And also a lot of our landscapes are beautiful and toxic. So there's kind of this parallel again that goes on there between the two. So it's about continuing to explore this thing of the removal, the dualities, the toxicity, the beauty, the dark, the light, and just seeing how this keeps winding its way into the stories of our country, and just I guess the more places that I can delve into, the more I can hopefully tell these other stories of England.
Well, thank you. It's been wonderful speaking with you, and it's been such delight I say delight, I don't know if delight's the right word, but such an interesting and in-depth and enriching conversation about your work and how we can all see and look at the landscape around us. So thanks again. It's been wonderful speaking with you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning into my conversation with Twinkle. Speaking with her has really opened my eyes to the layers and influences on the English landscape. More information on Twinkle are in the show notes. In the next episode, I'll be speaking with Casey Orr. Her photography centers on identity, community, fashion, and youth culture. You won't want to miss it.